At 33 minutes past 1 in the morning, on October 14, 1942, the first 14-inch shell came down beside Henderson Field. Pharmacist's mate Luis Ortega was flat inside a dugout when the ground lifted under him. Then another shell, and another. Out in the dark water, 2 Japanese battleships, Kongō and Haruna, had begun working across the airfield, one section at a time. They were more than 10 miles offshore. Nothing the Americans had on that beach could reach them. For roughly 80 minutes, they threw more than 900 heavy shells into a strip of dirt on Guadalcanal. By the time the guns went quiet, roughly half the aircraft on the field were burning. Almost all of the aviation gasoline was gone. The runway looked less like a runway than a field that had been plowed by something enormous. Japan had done exactly what it came to do. Henderson Field looked finished. But before the sun was fully over the island, men started climbing out of their holes, and on that broken ground, something taxied forward, picked up speed, and left the earth. This is not a story about a miracle. It is not the story of one famous commander. It is the story of tired men who decided the field would fly again before the enemy could come back. Luis Ortega was a Navy corpsman attached to the 7th Marines. His job was the part of war that happens to the human body. When a man was hit, Ortega was the one who came for him. He had been on the island for weeks, and by October the men on Guadalcanal were worn thin, short on food, short on medicine, many of them shaking with fevers they could not shake off. That was the ground Ortega worked. Sick men, hurt men, and never enough of anything to treat them with. On Guadalcanal, the enemy was never only the Japanese. It was the mosquitoes, the rotting rations, the wet that never left a man's boots. Fever moved through the ranks like a second army, and a man could be flattened by it as easily as by a bullet. A corpsman's hands were full even on the quiet days. So Ortega already knew, better than most, what his job really was: to hold a body together against everything the island could do to it. He had learned how to work through an air raid. A raid had a shape to it. The planes came over, they dropped what they carried, and they left. You could count on the leaving. When the sound faded, you stood up and you went to work. Naval gunfire had no shape. A battleship did not come over and leave. It sat out there in the dark and kept firing, minute after minute, and there was no way to know when the next shell would arrive, or where. So Ortega stayed down. That was the hard part. Not the noise, the stillness. He was a man trained to run toward the wounded, and the only useful thing he could do was refuse to move. If he stepped out into that, he would not save anyone. He would only become one more body for someone else to carry. Around him, the dugout shook. Dirt sifted down from the roof. After each burst, there was a short pocket of quiet, almost as if the field were holding its breath, and then the next round came tearing in. Somewhere out in that dark, there were men who needed him. He knew it, and he waited. That kind of courage does not photograph. No camera catches a man deciding to stay in a hole. But it was the first thing Henderson Field asked of the people on it that night: hold still, and last. As the shelling walked toward the airstrip, the fires it lit began to show what this place actually was. The shells were finding the parked aircraft now, and each one that caught threw enough light to see by. And in that light, you could finally see the truth about Henderson Field. It was not a modern airbase. It was a single runway scraped out of the coconut groves, a strip of dirt and gravel less than 4,000 feet long, with only about 1,000 feet of it covered in pierced steel matting. There were no proper hangars. No fuel trucks worth the name. No real repair shops. When it was dry, the field was choking dust. When it rained, it was mud so deep that men said a plane taking off looked like a fly trying to lift out of molasses. Wrecked aircraft sat parked beside aircraft that were still flying missions every day. Everything was close together, and everything was exposed. The whole place had been a coconut plantation before the war, laid out in neat rows between two rivers. Now those rows were a runway, a scatter of tents, and the men who lived and worked along the edge of both. They slept a few minutes' walk from the strip, close enough to carry a hurt pilot in from a crash, and close enough that whatever a shell could reach was landing where they lived. The man responsible for keeping this place running was a Marine major named Charles Hayes. Hayes did not have equipment. He had improvisation. When the field first needed lights so planes could land in the dark, there were no runway lights to install. So Hayes and his people took halves of coconut husks, spaced them along the edge of the strip, and filled them with gasoline. They lit a path out of the jungle with burning coconut shells. That was Henderson Field. It stayed alive not because of what it had, but because of what the men on it could make out of almost nothing. Keeping it flying was a daily act of scavenging, long before that night ever made it famous. There was no supply line feeding spare parts up to Guadalcanal on any schedule a mechanic could trust. So when an aircraft was too badly shot up to fly, it did not become junk. It became a source, a working propeller, a tire, an instrument, a length of control cable. The mechanics stripped the dead machines to keep the living ones in the air, and they had been doing it for weeks. The pilots flew, and landed, and flew again. Roy Geiger commanded them, and by the middle of October he had around 90 aircraft that could still get off the ground, dive bombers, fighters, a handful of others, operating from a strip a stateside base commander would not have recognized as an airfield at all. Every day, the same rhythm: fly, get hit, patch, fly again. Take apart what could not be saved, to keep flying what could. Now the same men watched it burn. Fuel drums went up in columns of flame. Telephone wire was torn out of the ground. Tents and radios simply ceased to exist where the shells landed, and there was nothing anyone could do but stay down and count the seconds. Before we go deeper into that night, if the men behind the famous battles matter to you, take a second to like this video. It helps keep their work, and the part of history they carried, from being forgotten. Those two battleships had not come for a patch of dirt by accident. They came because of what this field did every time the sun came up. The men on the ground already understood why they were being torn apart. By day, the aircraft flying off Henderson could find Japanese ships as they came down toward Guadalcanal, and hit them. By night, the balance flipped. Japanese warships would race down the channel the Americans called the slot. The darkness hid them from the planes. They could shell the beach, land troops, unload supplies, and pull back north before the sun came up and the Americans could see them again. The Americans had a name for those night runs: the Tokyo Express. Destroyers and fast ships slipping down the slot after dark to feed the Japanese soldiers already on the island. But troops and heavy guns could not all come down on fast destroyers. For a real offensive, Japan needed slow transport ships, and slow transports had to sit off the beach for hours to unload, exposed the whole time, with Henderson's aircraft never far away, which meant the airfield had to be silenced first, so the whole island ran on a clock. By day, pilots fought. By afternoon, mechanics patched what came back. By night, everyone lay in the dark and listened for the drone of ship engines or the whistle of the first shell. And in the morning, it started over. Henderson did not need to rule the Pacific. It only needed to stay alive long enough that Japan's slow transports could not unload in daylight. That was the entire war on Guadalcanal, boiled down to one runway. And it is why, on this particular night, Japan sent 2 battleships to kill it. The plan for this whole stretch of days was simple and heavy: smash Henderson with battleship guns, run a large convoy in behind the bombardment, land fresh troops, artillery and supplies, then take the field on the ground, once and for all. The men on the field were already exhausted before the battleships ever arrived. Just the day before, the first U.S. Army troops had come ashore to reinforce the Marines, soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment. Some of them would find themselves in the middle of all this within a day of setting foot on the island. That same day, October 13th, Japanese bombers had come over so high the Americans could not reach them. 55 fighters scrambled and still could not climb to where the bombers were. The bombs punched more than a dozen holes in the runway, set thousands of gallons of gasoline on fire, and destroyed a dozen aircraft on the ground. Then Japanese artillery ashore opened up and kept the field under fire. The Seabees ran out and filled the craters. A hole from a bomb could be packed and leveled in about half an hour when they had the trucks loaded and ready. They had spent that whole afternoon filling holes punched from the air. After midnight, the holes started coming from the sea, and these were far larger. It began with light. A Japanese float plane droned over the field and dropped flares, and the darkness that had been hiding everyone was pulled open. By that hanging light, the ships offshore could make out the shape of the field and walk their fire across it. Then the battleships opened up. For roughly 80 minutes, the two ships fired more than 900 14-inch shells into the American perimeter. To the men in the holes, it did not feel like 80 minutes. Ortega would remember it as hours. When a battleship sits offshore and works over a strip of ground, time stops meaning much to the people underneath it. Inside the dugout, Ortega felt the ground jump. He heard things coming down and could not tell how close, only that they kept coming. He pressed himself against the earth and counted the space between the bursts. There was nothing to do but last through it. Not far away, a mechanic watched the dispersal area burn. He knew every one of those aircraft. He knew which ones still flew. He knew each was full of fuel and ammunition, and he could not run out and drag a single one clear, because to step into that light was to die for nothing. A Seabee sat with a truck already loaded with dirt and had to leave it loaded. You cannot fill a crater while 14-inch shells are still falling. The tools you needed could be destroyed before you ever put them to use. So they waited, all of them. There was blast pressure that you felt in your chest. There was flying steel. There were fuel drums going off like enormous matches. Telephone lines whipped apart. Clothing and gear hung in the shredded trees, and across the surface of the runway, crater joined crater until the strip was not a strip anymore. Many of the shells were not armor-piercing rounds meant to punch through a ship's hull. They were fragmentation shells, made to burst and throw steel across open ground. Against tents, parked aircraft, and men in shallow holes, that was the most punishing choice the enemy could have made. It was not built to crack a runway. It was built to sweep clean everything standing on one. In a foxhole at the edge of the field, there was nothing to do but press flat, feel the earth slam upward with every hit, and hope the next one landed long. Then the guns stopped. At first, no one knew whether the silence meant the ships had gone, or whether they were only shifting their aim. Men held still and listened to a quiet that did not feel safe. But the battleships did not linger. Before first light, they turned and ran back up the slot. Even after all of that, they would not risk being caught in range once Henderson's planes could see them. The enemy had just spent 80 minutes trying to kill the field, and still would not be anywhere near it when the sun came up. That fact by itself told the men on the ground something worth holding on to. When the smoke finally began to lift, the field could count what the night had cost. 48 of its 90 aircraft were destroyed. Nearly all of the aviation gasoline had burned. 41 men were dead, 6 of them pilots. And yet, in Ortega's own aid area, not one man had been hurt. Most of the shells had fallen out on the airfield itself. Whether a man lived through that night often came down to one thing: whether he was underground when the shell arrived. The field was wrecked, but the men were still there. Ortega and the other corpsmen came up out of the ground first. They did not go to the runway. They went looking for people. They moved through the dark, calling names, checking the places that had just been hit, carrying the living back toward the aid stations. This was the work Ortega had trained for, and it was the work he had been unable to do for 80 minutes. Now he could do it. Only after that did the field's attention widen out to the machines. Mechanics moved through the parked aircraft, sorting the ones that could be saved from the ones that were finished. Ground crews began pulling the salvageable clear of the burning, and Major Hayes and his people walked the runway. Not to rebuild the whole thing, but to answer one question: was there any stretch of ground left, long enough and flat enough for a single airplane to get off? They paced it off in the dark. They marked what was solid and what was a crater. They found lengths that could be filled and lengths that would simply have to be flown around. This was not engineering out of a manual. It was men reading a ruined field by firelight, deciding foot by foot how much of it they could still use. They were not trying to make the field perfect. They were trying to make it usable. To me, Henderson Field was saved before any airplane ever took off, by tired men who refused to let sunrise find them beaten. And it worked. By the time the sky went from black to gray, the trucks were moving again. The same Seabees who had been forced to sit on their loaded trucks all through the shelling could finally do the thing they had been waiting to do: drive out onto the field and begin putting it back together. Within a few hours, one runway was back in operating condition. Damaged, patched, far from what it had been the day before, but usable. There were 2 B-17s on the field, both knocked out of action. They would never fly again. So the crews drained their tanks dry and carried the fuel away to aircraft that could still fly. Even the dead machines were made to give something back. That first gray light did not bring a dramatic counterattack. It brought something quieter and in a way harder to argue with. On a field the enemy believed was destroyed, aircraft were being made ready to fly. But the planes that could leave Henderson were not the real problem. The real problem was still coming toward it, a Japanese convoy that had not turned back. Anyone who thought the worst was over found out otherwise within hours. Through the day of October 14th, the air raids came back. The artillery ashore kept firing, and by that afternoon, the main runway was knocked out of normal service all over again. Henderson could no longer function as a base for heavy bombers. What kept aircraft flying at all was the backup, Fighter 1. Fighter 1 was the grass strip the Seabees of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion had cut earlier in the campaign. The pilots called it the cow pasture. It was rough, it depended on the weather, and it was really only good for light aircraft. But it was ground the men had prepared in advance, and now it was the thing keeping the Cactus Air Force alive. Help was already being pushed forward. From the base at Espiritu Santo, 17 dive bombers and 20 fighters were flown up to replace some of what had been lost, and transport aircraft began shuttling in fuel. But replacements took time to arrive, and the ships offshore were not going to wait. For the replacement pilots coming up from the rear, the approach to Henderson was its own introduction to Guadalcanal, a smoking strip below them, wrecked aircraft shoved off to the edges. Men waving them down onto a runway that had been a cratered ruin that same morning, and the field was not done being hit. That same night, the sea came back for it again. Japanese cruisers stood offshore and shelled Henderson for about half an hour, the second naval bombardment in as many nights. Bombed by day, shelled by the guns ashore, hammered from the water after dark. The attacks were not letting up, and the men had no reason to believe the next night would be any different. This was not one bad night to survive. It was a punishment that would not stop. And now there was a new problem, the worst kind. The fuel was almost gone. An officer put it plainly. There was barely enough gasoline left for a single effort against the ships that were coming. That turned the mechanics and ground crews into judges. Which aircraft could truly fly? Which ones would get the last of the fuel? Which ones would stay on the ground? Which ones would be taken apart so another could go up? These were not easy calls, and there was no manual for them. A man would look at one aircraft with a torn wing and a sound engine, and another with a clean airframe and an engine full of shrapnel, and decide in minutes which one might still kill a ship and which one was now only parts. A wrong guess wasted fuel nobody could spare. Every gallon spent on the wrong airplane was a gallon that would never come back. That night, the men at Henderson could hear the war moving closer. The ships they had failed to stop were now unloading within sight of the field. When the sun came up on October 15th, the men on the beach could see exactly what they were up against. Offshore, 6 Japanese transports and their escorts sat in plain view, close enough to make out. Only about 10 miles away, they were calmly putting men, guns, and supplies ashore. From the ground, the Americans could watch it happen. They could see the barges going back and forth. They could see the cargo coming off. Everything Japan had sent those battleships to make possible was unfolding right in front of them, in broad daylight, and there was almost nothing left in the tanks to answer it with. So the ground crews went looking for fuel everywhere it might still be. They went into the swamps and the thickets where drums had been rolled and hidden during earlier attacks. They went to small caches nobody had fully written down. They went back to the wrecked aircraft and to the machines that could not fly but still had fuel in their tanks. And this is the part that gets left out of the story. Finding the fuel was not the hard part. Making it usable was. Each drum had to be opened. The gasoline had to be checked for water and dirt, because contaminated fuel would kill an engine at the worst possible moment. The drums were rolled by hand across broken ground. The fuel was pumped through hoses and strained, in some cases filtered through soft leather to pull the water out of it. All of it, drum by drum, was moved to the handful of aircraft that had been chosen to fly. And they did this with one eye on the sky, because the next attack could come at any moment. There was nothing glamorous in any of it. It was heavy, filthy, dangerous work, rolling steel drums of gasoline across a cratered field while more shells or bombs might arrive at any hour, straining fuel by hand so an engine would not quit out over the water. The men doing it would not be in the cockpit when it counted. They were simply making sure that someone else could be. By the end of it, the crews had scraped together roughly 400 drums of gasoline out of swamps, wrecks, and hiding places, enough for about 2 more days of operations. And from Espiritu Santo, transport planes kept coming in, a dozen drums at a time, each one landing on a field that was still being shelled and bombed. The first dawn had proved that Henderson Field was still alive. The second would show Japan exactly why it had tried so hard to kill it. The pilots climbed into the aircraft. The men who had found the fuel stepped back. Their part of the mission would stay on the ground. Watch one airplane go, and you understand all of it. A mechanic signals that it is ready. The bombs are hung by hand, because there is no proper equipment to lift them. The last of the strained fuel goes into the tank. The pilot climbs in. The engine coughs, dust, mud, and damage fighting it, and then catches. The airplane rolls forward, bumping over the patched stretch of runway, past the craters that were packed only hours ago. The men on the ground watch the wheels leave the earth, and then it is gone, out toward the ships, and the crews turn around and start on the next one. That morning and through the day, the aircraft off Henderson went after the convoy again and again. Wildcats. The stubby P-400s, each carrying a small bomb. Dive bombers. They came at the transports through the anti-aircraft fire the Japanese threw up at them. They flew wave after wave. A plane would lift off, make its run, and come back, and the crews would turn it around and send it out again on whatever fuel was left. There was a hard truth in the air over Guadalcanal that the American crews were counting on. An American plane, shot up over the island, could often limp the short distance back to Henderson and be patched to fly another day. A damaged Zero, far from its own base at Rabaul, was more likely to go down into the sea than to see home again. Every mile between a man and his airfield was a mile that could kill him. Henderson was right there. That was the whole reason to keep it alive. 3 of the cargo ships were destroyed. The rest were driven off, but only after they had already put a great deal of their cargo ashore. Some of the surviving transports were deliberately run aground at Tassafaronga, beached so their holds could be dragged onto the island before the planes came back around. Japan was no longer unloading at leisure. It was unloading like men who had realized the field above them was not dead after all. This was not a clean victory. Thousands of Japanese troops landed on Guadalcanal in those days with their weapons and supplies. The men at Henderson had not stopped that, but they had made one thing true that Japan could not undo. Those transports could not finish their work unwatched. What rose from Henderson that morning was more than a few battered airplanes. It was the return of daylight, and daylight was the one thing that convoy could not stay beneath. The pilots would get most of the credit because they were the ones people could see, up in the sky. But every takeoff was the work of dozens of hands that never left Guadalcanal. The man who filled the crater never knew whether the plane that rolled over his work would come back. The corpsman never knew whether the next man on his table would be a pilot, a mechanic, or the man who had been working beside him a moment before. It would be easy, and wrong, to say the bombardment failed. In pure destruction, it was terrible. It destroyed dozens of aircraft. It burned nearly all the fuel. It killed 41 men. It knocked the field out of normal service, and it let a convoy reach the island. By any measure of damage, Japan won that night. But damage was never really the point. The battleships had one job that mattered more than any of that: keep Henderson silent long enough for the transports to unload in peace. And that is the one thing they could not do. The men on the field did not need it to be whole. They needed a long enough stretch of runway, a few aircraft, a little fuel, one more morning, and every time they found a way to have it. It is worth sitting with how small those requirements sound and how much they actually cost. A stretch of runway, a handful of planes, a little gasoline. Put that way, it is almost nothing. But every piece of it was dragged out of a burning field by hand, by men who had been under attack for days, bombed and shelled around the clock, and had every reason to believe the next night would be the same. Think back to Ortega, down in that hole. He never saw the strategic picture. He could not have. From the ground, in the smoke, all he saw the next morning was a haze hanging over everything, and coconut groves that had stood for miles the day before simply gone, swept flat. He saw the wounded. He saw the field on fire. And then he saw something else out on the water. Those transports, calmly unloading, as if the airfield were already dead. They were not. The fuel his fellow crews were straining through leather at that very moment would go up into the air and out toward those exact ships. That is the part of Henderson Field that no camera ever captured. Not the ships sunk. Those got counted. The men who ran the stretchers, the men with the shovels, the men rolling drums by hand and pulling a part off a dead airplane to keep a live one flying. Most of their names were never written down anywhere. They did not fly the missions that filled the reports. They only made those missions possible. Japan had enough firepower to destroy Henderson Field in a night. It did not have enough time to keep the men from rebuilding it by morning. So come back to where it started. Gray light, smoke still on the ground. One airplane bumping across a patched runway and then its wheels lifting off the earth. The men who made that happen did not stand around to watch. They turned back to the next one. The aircraft that left Henderson did not erase what happened in the night. They could not bring back the men who were lost. They could not replace every plane, every tool, every gallon of fuel that had burned. But each takeoff said the same thing: The field was damaged, not surrendered, and maybe that is why Henderson Field still matters. Not because it could not be destroyed, it very nearly was, but because ordinary men kept repairing it faster than the war could finish tearing it down. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in World War II, share what he told you in the comments. Not only the battles from the books, the small things he remembered, and the stories he rarely spoke about. So many of those were never written into the official history. They deserve a place here. The planes left the ground. The men who made it possible stayed behind in the dust.
June 16th, 1943. Buka Island, Solomon Islands. A single B-17, no escort, no formation, just one bomber, is flying a photo reconnaissance mission over Japanese-held territory. The crew can see the airfield below. They can count the fighters parked on the strip, and they can see 21 of those fighters beginning to taxi. The Japanese pilots climb toward the bomber. They've done this before. They know the drill. Come in fast. Aim for the cockpit. Aim for the engines. The men behind the guns, the gunners, ignore them. That's what the manual says. Gunners are not trained fighters. They are secondary targets. They are not the threat. The first zero comes in from the front, and the nose gunner, a 28-year-old former coal miner's son from Simpson, Pennsylvania, opens fire with twin .50 caliber machine guns. He hits the lead fighter. The second fighter follows. He hits that one too. Then a 20mm cannon shell explodes inside his compartment and throws him backward out of his seat. Shrapnel tears through his body. The plexiglass nose of the bomber is shattered. The wind is screaming in at 200 miles per hour. He drags himself back to the gun. Another zero is coming in. He fires. He will not survive this mission. 8 of those fighters just learned something the manual never told them. The man they were trained to ignore was the most dangerous thing in the sky. If your father or grandfather sat behind a gun on a B-17 or B-24, if he was one of those men, hit the like button. Not for this video. So more people know what those men did up there. This is what Japan's pilots said about them, and why every word of it is proof that the Japanese military got it wrong from the very beginning. Before the war, Japan built one of the most selective fighter pilot programs in the world. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy accepted 1,500 applicants for flight training at Tsuchiura. Of those 1,500, 25 graduated. Not 25%. 25 men. 1 in 60. The rest were washed out, physically, mentally, or both. Those 25 were genuine elite. They trained for over 2 years, longer than any fighter pilot program in the world at the time. Aerobatics, individual gunnery, formation flying, navigation, night operations, and above all, one-on-one dogfighting. The doctrine they absorbed was built around a single belief: a skilled pilot in a superior aircraft could control the outcome of any engagement. One man, one machine, one result. Skill over everything. Japanese naval aviation did not train pilots to fight as part of a system. It trained them to fight as individuals, samurai of the air. That belief wasn't arrogance. It was confirmed by results. And in 1941, no Air Force in the world could say otherwise. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the finest carrier fighter in the world in 1940. It was fast. It climbed faster than anything in the Allied inventory. It could turn inside any American fighter at the time: the P-40 Warhawk, the F-4F Wildcat, the P-39 Airacobra. When paired with pilots who had 2 to 3 years of intensive training, the combination was devastating. And when those pilots studied American bombers, their assessment was logical. A B-17 Flying Fortress carried up to 13 50-caliber machine guns spread across multiple positions: tail, ball turret, waist, top turret, nose. Impressive on paper. But each gun was operated independently by a single man. Each man had a limited field of fire, restricted by the structure of the aircraft itself. Each man was tracking a target moving at closing speeds of 300 to 500 miles per hour. And each gunner was operating alone, reacting to an attack, not initiating one. The conclusion: approach from the right angle, at sufficient speed, and the defensive fire would not be accurate enough to matter. Concentrate on the engines and the cockpit. That's where the bomber dies. Japanese training films reinforced the point. One film used a captured B-17D, repainted with American insignia, to demonstrate attack angles for key 43 pilots. The turret positions were barely mentioned. In the early months of the war, that conclusion held up. The Philippines. December 1941. Bo-17 Isis based at Clark Field were caught on the ground and destroyed in the opening hours of the Japanese attack. The few that flew combat missions operated in ones and twos, with no formation discipline and crews that had never experienced fighter attack. Japanese pilots attacked with confidence and scored kills with acceptable losses. Saburo Sakai, who would become one of the most famous fighter aces of the Pacific War, shot down Captain Colin Kelly's B-17 on December 10, 1941. It was the first flying fortress lost in combat. Sakai later described being surprised by the sheer physical size of the B-17, and he developed a respect for the bomber's ability to absorb damage. But the defensive fire he encountered was manageable. He attacked from above, avoided the tail, put rounds into the engines. The B-17 went down. His Zero was intact. Through 1942, across the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, Japanese fighter pilots continued to intercept B-17 with confidence. American losses were significant. Japanese losses to defensive fire were low. Every engagement confirmed the doctrine. What the manual did not account for was speed of adaptation. The Americans were changing. Their formations were tightening. Their gunners were accumulating combat experience. And the survival rate of experienced gunners was creating something Japan's doctrine never modeled: institutional memory behind the guns. The men Japan's pilots were trained to dismiss were not career soldiers. Most of them held no commission. They were enlisted men, staff sergeants, technical sergeants, corporals. Many were 19 years old. Some were 18. A few had lied about their age. They came from farms in Kansas and Iowa, from steel mills in Pittsburgh and Gary, from fishing towns on the coast of Maine, from grocery stores and gas stations and high school classrooms. They signed up or were drafted, went through basic training, and ended up assigned to gunnery school, not because they chose the most dangerous job on a bomber, but because the Army Air Forces needed bodies behind guns. Their training was compressed. A few weeks of ground school covering aircraft identification, gun mechanics, and theory of deflection shooting. Skeet shooting on the ground to build the reflexes of tracking a moving target. Then camera gun exercises aboard training aircraft, firing at a towed target sleeve. Then live fire at towed targets from the waist or turret of a bomber. Then a shipping manifest. Then New Guinea, or North Africa, or England. Then combat. The positions they filled were designed for function, not for the men who had to sit in them. The ball turret was a Sperry-built sphere of aluminum and plexiglass that hung from the belly of the B-17 like an egg. Inside it, a man curled with his knees drawn to his chest, his back against a curved armor plate. Twin, 50 caliber guns extending between his legs. The turret rotated 360 degrees horizontally and nearly 90 degrees vertically. He could see the earth 25,000 feet below him through a small window between his feet. There was no room for a parachute inside the turret. If the hydraulic system was shot out, the turret could not be rotated to align with the fuselage hatch. If the landing gear failed and the bomber had to make a belly landing, the ball turret would hit the ground first. Many ball turret gunners were selected for the job because they were small, 5'4", 5'6", 130 pounds. The selection criteria was not skill, it was body size, because no one bigger could fit. The tail gunner sat alone at the very back of the aircraft, facing rearward, sealed off from the rest of the crew by a narrow crawl space through the fuselage. If the midsection of the aircraft took a heavy hit, if fire broke out or structural damage blocked the passageway, the tail gunner was isolated. No way forward, no way to help or be helped. His only exit was a small hatch behind him that opened into a 25,000-foot drop. The waist gunners stood at open windows, literally open, in early B-17 models, on either side of the rear fuselage. At altitude, the wind came through those openings at 200 miles per hour, and the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They wore electrically heated flight suits that shorted out in the cold. They wore leather gloves lined with wool that made it difficult to operate the gun's charging handle. They wore oxygen masks that iced over if the moisture from their breath accumulated. And they stood there, hour after hour, scanning the sky, waiting for something to come at them that moved faster than anything they had ever seen. These men had the highest casualty rate of any crew position on American heavy bombers during the war. The Army Air Forces published the statistics. The men read them. The men who had completed 3 missions knew the numbers as well as any actuary. And every morning, when the briefing ended and the trucks drove them out to the hard stands, they climbed back into the aircraft. Not because they were brave in the way movies portray bravery, because the alternative was to not climb in, and the man next to them was climbing in, and the man next to him was climbing in. And that was enough. June 16th, 1943. The mission over Buka. The B-17 was an old E model, tail number 41-2666. The crews called it Old 666. It had been abandoned at a New Guinea airstrip, parked at the far end of the field, stripped for parts by mechanics cannibalizing it for other aircraft. Nobody wanted it. The tail number, 666, didn't help. A pilot named Captain J. Zemer wanted it. Zemer was a good pilot with a bad reputation for ignoring regulations. He had trouble getting assigned his own aircraft because his crew, a group that called themselves the Eager Beavers, had a habit of volunteering for missions that other crews declined. Zemer took Old 666, rebuilt it from the ground up, and modified it into something the Army Air Forces had never seen. He stripped every non-essential piece of equipment, including the crew's relief tubes, and replaced the weight with weapons. He swapped the single 30 caliber nose gun for twin 50 calibers. He added extra 50 caliber positions at the waist and radio compartment. He installed a fixed forward firing gun for himself in the cockpit. By the time he was finished, Old 666 carried 19.5 0 caliber machine guns. It was the most heavily armed B-17 in the Pacific Theater. The bombardier who volunteered for the nose gun position that day was Second Lieutenant Joseph Raymond Sarnowski. Sarnowski was 28 years old, the second of 17 children born to a Polish coal miner in Simpson, Pennsylvania, a small town just north of Carbondale, in the anthracite country. When his father's health failed, the family left the mines and started farming. Joe worked the farm, finished high school, and enlisted in the Army at 21. He trained in aircraft armament, then bombardier mechanics, then bombing technique. He reached the Pacific in January 1942 and spent 18 months flying combat missions over Rabaul, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. He earned the Silver Star. He earned the Air Medal. By June 1943, he had been ordered home to train new bombardier recruits. His departure date was June 19th. 3 days away. He didn't have to be on the June 16th mission. Photo reconnaissance didn't require a bombardier. His skills weren't needed. But the mission was over heavily defended enemy territory, with no escort, in a single aircraft. The nose of the B-17, the most vulnerable position during a head-on attack, needed its best gunner. Sarnowski volunteered. Over Buka. The crew photographed the Japanese airfield and then continued south on the mapping run over Bougainville. They could see fighters taking off below. Allied intelligence didn't know that the Japanese had moved roughly 400 fighters into the Solomon Islands the day before. With about a minute left in the mapping run, 8 A-6M30s from the 251st Kokutai attacked from the front. A coordinated, head-on assault. Sarnowski opened fire from the nose. He hit the lead zero and damaged a second. Then a 20mm cannon shell exploded inside the nose compartment. The blast threw him completely out of his position. Shrapnel ripped through his body. He crawled back to the gun. Another Zero was bearing down on them from 12 o'clock. He grabbed the handles. He fired. He drove off the second wave. Then he collapsed over his weapon. The pilot, Zimmer, was hit by 4 20mm shells that destroyed his instrument panel and broke his left leg above and below the knee. Shrapnel was embedded in both arms and his right leg. 3 other crew members were wounded. The oxygen system was destroyed. The hydraulics were gone. Zimmer flew the aircraft 500 miles back to New Guinea on the co-pilot's instruments, passing in and out of consciousness, refusing to let anyone take the controls. They made an emergency landing at Dobadura, a fighter strip, with no brakes and no flaps. The co-pilot ground-looped the B-17 to a stop. Sergeant John Pugh, the tail gunner, had crawled forward during the flight to check on Sarnowski. He found him slumped at his gun, finger still on the trigger. Pugh lifted him, carried him to the rear of the nose compartment, and held him. Halfway home, Sarnowski died in his arms. Sarnowski received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Zimmer received it too. It was the only time in World War II that 2 men from the same crew earned the Medal of Honor for separate acts of heroism in the same engagement. The other 7 crew members each received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest valor award in the Army. It remains the most decorated single air combat mission in American military history. I think about him sometimes. 28 years old, 3 days from going home. He climbed into a seat he didn't have to be in because he couldn't let his crew fly without him at the nose. The air war over the Pacific changed the equation for Japanese fighter pilots twice. Each time, the men they were trained to ignore were at the center of it. 1942 to 1943. New Guinea. Rabaul. The Solomons. In the Southwest Pacific. B-17S operated in small formations, 3 to 6 aircraft, sometimes fewer. Nothing approaching the 1,000 bomber streams that flew over Germany. But even those small formations taught American crews a lesson that transformed their survival. If you fly close enough together, your gun coverage overlaps. When 3 B-17S held tight formation, a Japanese fighter approaching 1 bomber flew into the combined field of fire from 2 or 3 aircraft simultaneously, individually. A waist gunner might miss, individually. A tail gunner might fire too late, but collectively, 12, 18, 24 guns tracking the same inbound fighter, the probability of scoring hits increased dramatically. Japanese pilots noticed the change before their commanders acknowledged it. Saburo Sakai, who had attacked B-17S with confidence in 1941, described later encounters with American formations over New Guinea as fundamentally different. The defensive fire was no longer sporadic. It was layered. He wrote about the B-17's 6.50 caliber machine guns being deadly, about attacking a flying fortress and coming away with his Zero riddled with holes. He described the B-17 as the toughest and most respected American aircraft of the early war. Other pilots in the Tainan Air Group, the unit that produced Sakai, Nishizawa, and Ota, three of the highest-scoring aces in Japanese military aviation, reported similar experiences. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, later credited with more aerial victories than nearly any other Japanese pilot, flew against B-17 formations over Rabaul and New Guinea throughout 1942 and into 1943. The Tainan Air Group was arguably the most skilled fighter unit in the Japanese Navy. Its pilots had accumulated hundreds of combat hours. They were the best Japan had, and even they found that the approach from behind and below, the standard doctrine that had worked in the Philippines, was becoming increasingly costly over New Guinea. American gunners were learning, not in a classroom, in the air. The ones who survived 5 missions learned to anticipate attack angles. The ones who survived 10 learned to read the slight wing dip that preceded a firing pass. They were firing earlier, opening up at longer range, filling the approach corridor with tracer. They were tracking better. They were scoring hits that shredded control surfaces and punctured fuel lines and killed engines on zeros before the pilot could close to effective cannon range. The Japanese response was to shift attack geometry. Head-on passes, approaching from 12 o'clock, directly in front of the bomber, became the preferred tactic. At 500 miles per hour combined closing speed, the engagement window was less than 3 seconds. The nose of early B-17 models was the weakest defensive position, a single .30 caliber gun that could barely scratch a Zero's engine cowling. A head-on pass bypassed the heavy tail, waist, and turret guns entirely, and for a time, it worked. But the Americans adapted faster. Later, B-17 models added chin turrets and dual 50 caliber nose guns. Zimmer's crew had already improvised this modification months before the factories caught up. The top turret could rotate forward to cover the 12 o'clock approach. Japanese pilots executing head-on attacks discovered they were no longer flying through empty air. They were flying into converging fire from the nose and the top turret. At 500 miles per hour, there was no time to adjust. By mid-1943, Japanese fighter units in the Southwest Pacific were losing experienced pilots faster than the training pipeline could replace them. Not all losses were to bomber gunners, P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks, and operational accidents took a constant toll. But the gunners represented something the Japanese doctrine had never modeled: attrition from a source that was supposed to be irrelevant. Every experienced pilot lost to defensive fire was a pilot who required 2 or more years to train. Every gunner who shot one down required weeks to produce. The asymmetry was quiet. It didn't announce itself in a single decisive battle. It accumulated, mission after mission, until the veteran pilot roster was thinning and the replacements arriving from Japan were measurably less skilled than the men they replaced. 1944 to 1945. The Marianas, over Japan. In November 1944, a new bomber appeared over the Japanese home islands. The B-29 Superfortress was not an improved B-17. It was a different weapon system. It flew higher, above 30,000 feet. It flew faster, over 350 miles per hour. It carried twice the bomb load. And its defensive gunnery system was a generation beyond anything that had existed before. On a B-17, a gunner sat inside his turret or stood at an open window. He sighted along his gun barrel through a ring sight. He estimated range by eye. He estimated deflection by instinct. He did this in -40-degree cold, wearing heavy gloves, breathing through an oxygen mask, while an airplane tried to kill him. On a B-29, the gunners sat inside a pressurized cabin at 70 degrees. They wore shirt sleeves. They looked through 5 optical sighting stations, positioned in the nose, the upper fuselage, both side blisters, and the tail, and each station was connected to a General Electric analog computer. The computer calculated airspeed, altitude, air temperature, humidity, parallax, the difference in angle between where the gunner was sitting and where the turret was pointing, bullet drop over distance, lead angle for a moving target. The gunner put the crosshair on the target and tracked it smoothly. The computer did the math. The turret, positioned yards away from the gunner, followed the computed solution, not the raw sight line. Through a system of electrical switches, each gunner had primary control of one turret and secondary control of others, meaning one man could direct fire from 2 turrets simultaneously. The fire control officer, sitting on an elevated seat the crews called the barber's chair, managed the distribution, reassigning turrets to whichever gunner had the best angle on an incoming fighter. The turrets themselves were small, streamlined, and unmanned. No gunner inside, no plexiglass bubble to shatter. Each carried twin .50 caliber guns. The tail position added a 20mm cannon. Total, 10.50 caliber machine guns and 1 cannon, all computer-directed, all remote-controlled, all operated by men sitting in comfort. The men operating this system held the same ranks as the gunners on a B-17, but now they were running a computerized weapons platform. On November 24, 1944, 111 B-29s took off from the Marianas for the first major raid against the Japanese mainland, targeting the Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino, just outside Tokyo. 94 reached the target. Mechanical failures and the jet stream, a high-altitude wind phenomenon American crews had never encountered, scattered the rest. But 94 B-29s over Tokyo was still the largest American bombing force Japan had ever seen. The last time bombers appeared over the capital was the Doolittle raid of April 1942, 13 medium bombers sneaking in at rooftop level. This was different. Japanese Ki-44 Shoki interceptors scrambled from airfields around Tokyo. They were fast, purpose-built for high-altitude interception, and their pilots attacked aggressively. They shot down 5 B-29s. But the Superfortress gunners fought back with a volume and accuracy of fire that stunned interceptor pilots accustomed to the manual turrets on older bombers. In earlier B-29 raids over Kyushu, flown from China bases by XX Bomber Command, gunners had already demonstrated the system's lethality, claiming multiple fighters destroyed per mission. The pattern held over Tokyo. For every B-29 Japan shot down, its fighter force bled pilots and aircraft it could not afford to lose. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japanese pilots confronting B-29 formations for the first time found that every tactic that had been developed against B-17S was inadequate. The head-on approach that worked against B-17S with weak nose, armament ran into computer-directed fire that tracked faster and corrected more accurately than any human gunner. The approach from below, which exploited the ball turret's limited traverse on a B-17, met remotely controlled lower turrets that could rotate without the physical limitations of a man inside. The approach from the side encountered blister gunners who could hand off targeting to multiple turrets. There was no safe angle. Japanese after-action reports from late 1944 reflect this. Pilots described firing passes where they scored hits on B-29 engines and fuselage, hits that would have crippled a B-17. Only to watch the Superfortress continue flying in formation, its turrets still tracking, still firing. The B-29 was not only better defended, it was harder to kill. heavier armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, 4 engines instead of 2 that mattered, that a pilot could damage a B-29 and still die in the attempt, because the bomber absorbed his rounds and its gunners did not miss. The Japanese military's tactical response tells you more than any testimony. In December 1944, Army fighter pilots flying Ki-61s began executing ramming attacks against B-29s. The program was called Shinten Seikutai, striking the sky. In theory, the pilot would slam his fighter into the bomber's wing or tail at high speed, disable it, and then bail out. In practice, at combat velocities, the distinction between a ramming attack and a suicide attack barely existed. Many pilots did not survive. That a military command instructed its trained fighter pilots to physically crash their aircraft into bombers because the bomber's defensive fire could not be overcome by conventional means is a statement about the gunners that no memoir or debrief needs to elaborate on. You don't ram an airplane you can shoot down. You don't sacrifice a pilot you can't afford to lose unless every conventional approach has already failed. The ramming order was an admission written in operational language. By the spring of 1945, it was over. The training pipeline that once took 2 years had been compressed to months. New pilots arrived with flight hours that would not have qualified them for a pre-war checkout flight, let alone combat. They were sent against formations of B-29s, now escorted by P-51 Mustangs operating from Iwo Jima. On May 29, 1945, 454 B-29s hit Yokohama. 26 Japanese fighters were destroyed. 4 B-29s were lost. After that date, Japanese interceptors appeared less and less often. By June, American bombers controlled the airspace over Japan without serious opposition. The pilots Japan sent up in those final months were not Saburo Sakai. They were young men, some with fewer than 100 flight hours, pushed through programs that would have been unrecognizable to the veterans who trained before the war. They climbed into aircraft that were outmatched in speed, climb rate, and firepower against a defensive weapons system that Japan's best pilots had already proven unable to defeat. And they went up anyway, because they were told to, and most of them did not come back. When the war ended, the officers came home to recognition. Pilots were decorated and celebrated. Jimmy Stewart had flown missions over Europe. Clark Gable had flown missions over Europe. They were officers with rank and public profiles. Their stories made the papers. The gunners came home to nothing in particular. They were enlisted men. Nobody interviewed them. They didn't write best-selling memoirs. They didn't have publicists. Hollywood didn't make movies about the 19-year-old from Ohio who manned the waist gun at 25,000 feet in a 40-below wind chill, or the kid from Pennsylvania who died at his gun 3 days before he was supposed to go home. They went back to their towns. They went back to their trades. The ball turret gunner went back to the machine shop. The waist gunner went back to the family farm. The tail gunner enrolled at the state college on the GI Bill and never mentioned to his classmates that he'd spent a year sitting alone in the back of a bomber watching Japanese fighters try to kill him. Some of them talked about it late at night, after enough drinks. To the only people who would understand, other men who had been there, most of them didn't talk about it at all. But Japan talked about them. In the post-war interrogations conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Japanese officers and pilots were asked detailed questions about every aspect of American air operations. What surprised them? What disrupted their planning? What they could not counter? The defensive firepower of American bomber formations appears throughout those transcripts, not as a footnote, not as an afterthought, but as a consistent element in the erosion of Japan's fighter capabilities. In published memoirs by surviving Japanese aces, Sakai's samurai, foremost among them, The descriptions of attacking American bomber formations carry a weight that is absent from the pre-war training doctrine. Sakai recounted watching wingmen shot apart by defensive fire. He wrote about missions where his own Zero came back riddled with holes from guns that weren't supposed to be a factor. In Japanese naval aces and fighter units in World War II, compiled by Ikuhiko Hata and Yasuho Izawa, the most comprehensive record of Japanese naval aviation in the war, the attrition of experienced pilots across the Southwest Pacific is documented unit by unit. The causes were multiple: fighter versus fighter combat, accidents, tropical disease, operational exhaustion. But bomber defensive fire runs through the record as a persistent, steady drain, not always the largest single factor, but the one that nobody on the Japanese side planned for, because the doctrine said it wouldn't exist. Nobody is making the claim that bomber gunners single-handedly won the air war over the Pacific. The fighters mattered. Industrial capacity mattered. Logistics mattered. Intelligence mattered. But the Japanese military built an entire combat philosophy around one assumption: the men sitting behind the guns on American bombers were not worth worrying about. And those men proved that assumption wrong, not with superior training, not with superior technology, though the B-29's fire control system was revolutionary, with consistency, with showing up behind the guns and doing the work until the enemy ran out of pilots to send against them. And the enemy's own records say so. The pilot in the Zero flew the textbook approach. He came in at the angle the manual prescribed. He aimed where the manual told him to aim. And somewhere between the manual and the reality, between the classroom and the sky over New Guinea, between the doctrine and the cockpit over Tokyo, he learned that the manual was wrong. The men it told him to ignore were the ones who changed everything. Not because they were special, because they weren't. They sat in freezing turrets at 25,000 feet or in pressurized cabins over Tokyo, and they did the job, the same job, every mission, until there was nothing left to fly against them. Japan's best pilots could not solve them. Japan's best tacticians could not plan around them. And Japan's own words, in debriefs, in memoirs, in interrogation rooms, say so. A lot of those men never wrote their stories down, never went on television, never told anyone except maybe their families, at the dinner table, years after the war, when something reminded them of something they'd rather forget. If your father or your grandfather was one of them, if you heard those stories growing up, the ones he only told once, or the ones he never finished, write them in the comments. History doesn't capture everything. Textbooks don't have room for every name, but those stories shouldn't disappear.
Amid the stifling air on the deck of the Ise at Kure in 1945, sweat drenching the backs of sailors as American bombs whistled down from 14,000 feet, panic spreading to the extreme with the chain explosion of the ammunition depot. Only 13 minutes later, the hybrid ship sank with 700 lives. But why did Japan expect this hybrid design to turn the tide after Midway? From Imperial Japanese Navy internal records, let's decode the paradox between desperate hope and swift failure, with lessons on American air power. The date was July 28, 1945. The Japanese battleship Ise lay anchored in Kure Harbor, part of the Imperial Japanese Navy's last remnants, now a floating fortress turned desperate experiment. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin like a premonition. Sailors on deck scanned the skies, their uniforms soaked through, hearts pounding as the distant drone of engines grew louder. Task Force 38. The United States Navy's Carrier Strike Group unleashed over 1,000 aircraft that day. Waves of Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avenger torpedo bombers swarmed in. At 9:45 in the morning, the alarms blared. Sailors scrambled to their anti-aircraft guns, fingers slick on triggers, eyes wide in the glare of the morning sun. The first bombs fell like judgment. 1,100-pound general-purpose bomb slammed into the starboard bow, ripping through the deck plating with a deafening roar. Shrapnel flew. Men screamed as blood mixed with seawater. Seconds later, another hit the flight deck. That makeshift hybrid edition, the 70-meter strip meant to launch planes, but now a vulnerability. The hangar below ignited, fuel lines bursting, sending flames shooting up like geysers. Panic set in. Officers barked orders over the intercom, but the chain reaction had begun. A third bomb pierced turret number 3, the forward 14-inch guns, detonating the magazine with an apocalyptic blast. Pressure waves of 8,000 pounds per square inch tore through bulkheads, flinging bodies overboard. The ship listed 15 degrees to port, water pouring in through ragged holes. Sailors clung to railings, their faces contorted in terror as the cold reality of the Pacific contrasted with the inferno aboard. By 9:58 in the morning, just 13 minutes from the first strike, the Issei capsized, her pagoda mast crumpling into the bay. 700 men perished, trapped in compartments or drowned in the oily water. The total crew had been 1,463. Survivors clung to debris, their cries echoing across the harbor. This was no ordinary sinking. The Issei wasn't just a battleship anymore. She was a hybrid, a desperate fusion of dreadnought firepower and carrier ambition. Why had Japan poured resources into this Frankenstein of the seas, only for it to end in such swift catastrophe? To understand, we must go back to the ship's origins, decoding the chain of decisions that led here. The mystery starts in 1915, at the Kawasaki shipyard in Kobe. On November 10, the keel was laid for what would become the lead ship of her class. This was no hasty build. The Issei was designed as a super dreadnought, drawing lessons from the Russo-Japanese War's Tsushima triumph in 1905. Her hull stretched 208 meters long, with a beam of 28.7 meters and a draft of 8.7 meters. Displacement at commissioning, 36,500 tons. Power came from 24 Canpon boilers, driving 4 Parsons turbines for 45,000 shaft horsepower, pushing her to 23 knots, fast enough to keep pace with the fleet. Fuel bunkers held 5,000 tons of coal and 1,400 tons of oil, giving a range of 9,680 nautical miles at 14 knots. Armament was her crown jewel, 12 14-inch 45 caliber guns in 6 twin turrets, 3 forward, 3 aft, allowing salvos of 8 guns per broadside. Each shell weighed 635 kilograms, fired to 21,000 meters, capable of piercing 250 millimeters armor at 12,000 meters. Secondary battery, 16 5.5-inch guns in casemates along the hull, 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 4 submerged 21-inch torpedo tubes. Armor was Krupp steel, imported and domestically forged. A 12-inch belt amidships, 6-inch deck plating over vitals, 14-inch faces on turrets, and a 14-inch conning tower. Crew, 1,360 officers and men at launch. She was launched on November 12, 1916, sliding into the water amid cheers from yard workers and naval brass. Commissioned December 1, 1917, the Issei entered service as Japan flexed its naval muscle in World War I. But her role was subdued. Allied with Britain, she patrolled the Pacific, covering 5,000 nautical miles off Siberia in 1918 to 1920, hunting German raiders and supporting anti-Bolshevik forces. No major engagements. Her guns stayed silent, but the cruises tested her endurance. Boilers humming through storms, sailors drilling on deck in freezing winds. The real test came from home. On September 1, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake devastated Tokyo and Yokohama, killing over 105,000. The Ise, anchored nearby, received urgent orders. Sailors loaded 2,000 tons of rice, 800 barrels of fresh water, 200 liters each, and 500 crates of medical supplies in just 4 hours. She steamed to the disaster zone at 20 knots, arriving in 18 hours. The scene was chaos, rubble burning, survivors huddled on shores. Crew lowered boats, hauling aboard 450 civilians, 120 children, 80 injured. The aft deck became a makeshift hospital, naval surgeons treating burns and fractures under lanterns, dispensing porridge to 300 per shift. The ship offloaded 1,550-kilogram rice sacks to relief lines, lightening her load to 35,000 tons. This humanitarian mission highlighted her versatility, but it was a far cry from the combat she was built for. Back to routine. In the 1920s, modernization began at Kure Arsenal. Workers dismantled the old mast, erecting a towering pagoda structure, 40 meters high, with new Type 21 radar and optical rangefinders. Torpedo bulges added, widening her to 31.7 meters, boosting displacement to 40,169 tons. Boilers upgraded to oil-fired, power to 80,000 shaft horsepower, top speed 25 knots. Anti-aircraft suite expanded. 8 5-inch 40-caliber guns, 20 Type 96, 25-millimeter machine guns. Tests off Shikoku, firing 500 rounds at towed targets, hitting 60% at 5,000 meters. Officers in the wardroom sketched tactics, anticipating threats from Italian or British aircraft. The 1930s brought more refits, double-layered torpedo bulges, Type 22 search radar, fleet exercises near Okinawa, 150 main battery shells fired. Accuracy, 85%, at 18,000 meters. She was a symbol of imperial might. Then, war with China in 1937. The Eyes sailed to Shanghai in August, anchoring 3 nautical miles offshore. Turrets traversed 45 degrees, unleashing 320 14-inch shells on ports and depots, confirming 12 targets destroyed, warehouses erupting in flames. In May 1938 at Guangzhou, secondary guns fired 1,200 rounds, supporting infantry landings, blasting 5 ammo dumps sky-high. Captain's log. No losses, but 800 tons of ammunition expended. After Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Eyes stayed in reserve at Kure, her crew maintaining guns weekly, watching the horizon for the escalating Pacific War. She chased the Doolittle Raiders in April 1942, but missed contact. Midway loomed, the turning point that would force Japan's hand. The Ise, once invincible, was about to become a symbol of desperation. Unleashing 320 14-inch shells on ports and depots, confirming 12 targets destroyed. Warehouses erupting in flames. The air grew hot with explosions, smoke choking the horizon. Chaos on the shore as Chinese defenses crumbled. In May 1938 at Guangzhou, secondary guns fired 1,200 rounds, supporting infantry landings, blasting 5 ammo dumps sky-high. The blasts echoed across the bay, heat waves rippling the water, sailors wiping sweat from their eyes amid the roar. Captain's log noted no losses, but ammunition stocks dipped by 800 tons. These actions showcased her gunnery prowess, a dreadnought in her element. But the hybrid conversion changed everything. Completed in October 1943, the Ise emerged transformed, weight now 42,000 tons, speed still 25 knots, main guns reduced to 8 in 4 turrets forward. She conducted trials, off the coast, catapults hissing steam, planes lifting off one by one. But the delays were evident. 2 minutes per aircraft meant slow deployment in battle. The hangar, cramped and vulnerable, held fuel and ordnance too close to the hull. Anti-aircraft drills revealed more issues. 25mm guns jammed after prolonged fire, vibrations throwing off aim. Radar operators reported blind spots during storms, leaving the ship exposed for critical minutes. Pilot shortages compounded the problems. Japan's air arm decimated at Midway. Few experienced aviators left for hybrid ops. Training sessions in 1944 saw only simulated launches, no live combat drills. The mystery deepens. How could this design, born of desperation, be expected to counter America's carrier fleets? American designs like the Essex class emphasized robust armor and rapid air operations, with catapults cycling planes in seconds. Hangars protected by layered decks. Japan's hybrid was a patchwork, speed over durability, a thin compromise in a war of attrition. Fact is, the initial plan for 10 conversions evaporated. Steel shortages from Allied submarine campaigns, yard space tied up with repairs. Only Issei and Hyuga made the cut, a token effort in a losing game. This refit highlighted broader strategic flaws, clinging to battleship doctrine while carriers ruled the waves. The Eyes, now a mongrel of the seas, sailed into 1944 ready for testing. But the real trial awaited at Leyte Gulf, where the hybrid's weaknesses would surface amid chaos. The desperation hit hard after Midway. June 4–7, 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force shattered. 4 flat tops gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryi, in what sailors called the 5 minutes of hell. 304 aircraft lost, 3,057 men dead or missing. The cold shock of defeat settled over Tokyo like fog. In the dimly lit war rooms of the Navy Ministry, officers gathered, their brows furrowed, sweat beading despite the air-conditioned chill. Admiral Yamamoto's staff debated late into the night, voices rising in heated arguments. The paradox was clear. Japan needed air power to match America, but shipyards were strained, resources scarce. Battleships like the Eyes sat idle, relics of a FAO era. The idea emerged. Convert them. Hybrid carriers, blending dreadnought guns with flight decks. A desperate gamble to flip the script in the Pacific. The plan called for 10 old battleships, but only 2 proceeded, Ise and her sister, Hyuga. Hyuga's turret number 5 had exploded in a training mishap earlier that year, making her a prime candidate for refit. Work began in February 1943 at Kure Arsenal. 6 months of frantic labor. Yard workers, faces smeared with grease, torched away turrets number 5 and 6 aft, saving 2,500 tons of steel. In their place, a 70-meter flight deck, tapering from 29 meters wide forward to 18 aft. Below, a hangar for 22 to 24 aircraft, 12 Aichi-D 4Y dive bombers, 12 Yokosuka E-16 afloat planes, 2 rotating catapults installed, steam-powered, but with a fatal bottleneck. 2 minutes per launch. No full landing strip. Planes had to ditch or hoist back aboard via crane. Anti-aircraft upgrades followed. 16 twin 5-inch 40-caliber guns, over 100 Type 96 25mm machine guns. But flaws crept in. The 25mm mounts vibrated under fire, magazines too small for sustained bursts. Radar was Type 21 air search, Type 22 surface, but coverage gaps left 10-minute blind spots in bad weather. Pilot training lagged. Only basic drills by 1944. No combat launches. The chain of errors built. Japan prioritized speed and light armor, a thin-skinned hybrid that compromised both roles. Neither a true battleship nor a proper carrier. Compare to America. The Enterprise, with thick deck armor, launching over 100 planes a day, her air group turning tides at Guadalcanal. The IS's refit wasted steel Japan couldn't spare, canceled the full 10-ship plan due to shortages. A mystery unfolds. Why push this flawed compromise? Desperation blinded strategy. Before the hybrid madness, the IS had proven her worth in earlier conflicts. The Sino-Japanese War erupted in 1937. She deployed to Shanghai in August, anchoring 3 nautical miles out. Turrets swung 45 degrees, unleashing 320 14-inch shells on ports and depots, confirming 12 targets destroyed. Warehouses erupting in flames. The air grew hot with explosions, smoke choking the horizon. Chaos on the shore as Chinese defenses crumbled. In May 1938 at Guangzhou, secondary guns fired 1,200 rounds, supporting infantry landings, blasting 5 ammo dumps sky-high. The blasts echoed across the bay, heat waves rippling the water, sailors wiping sweat from their eyes amid the roar. Captain's log noted no losses, but ammunition stocks dipped by 800 tons. These actions showcased her gunnery prowess, a dreadnought in her element. But the hybrid conversion changed everything. Completed in October 1943, the IS emerged transformed. Weight now 42,000 tons, speed still 25 knots, main guns reduced to 8 in 4 turrets forward. She conducted trials off the coast, catapults hissing steam, planes lifting off one by one. But the delays were evident. 2 minutes per aircraft meant slow deployment in battle. The hangar, cramped and vulnerable, held fuel and ordnance too close to the hull. Anti-aircraft drills revealed more issues. 25mm guns jammed after prolonged fire, vibrations throwing off aim. Radar operators reported blind spots during storms, leaving the ship exposed for critical minutes. Pilot shortages compounded the problems. Japan's air arm decimated at Midway. Few experienced aviators left for hybrid ops. Training sessions in 1944 saw only simulated launches, no live combat drills. The mystery deepens. How could this design, born of desperation, be expected to counter America's carrier fleets? American designs like the Essex class emphasized robust armor and rapid air operations, with catapults cycling planes in seconds, hangars protected by layered decks. Japan's hybrid was a patchwork, speed over durability, a thin compromise in a war of attrition. Fact is, the initial plan for 10 conversions evaporated. Steel shortages from Allied submarine campaigns, yard space tied up with repairs. Only Issei and Hyuga made the cut, a token effort in a losing game. This refit highlighted broader strategic flaws, clinging to battleship doctrine while carriers ruled the waves. The Issei, now a mongrel of the seas, sailed into 1944 ready for testing. But the real trial awaited at Leyte Gulf, where the hybrid's weaknesses would surface amid chaos. Is less than, control 1-2 is greater than. The desperation hit hard after Midway, June 4-7, 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force shattered, 4 flat tops gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, in what sailors called the 5 minutes of hell. 304 aircraft lost, 3,057 men dead or missing. The cold shock of defeat settled over Tokyo like fog. In the dimly lit war rooms of the Navy Ministry, officers gathered, their brows furrowed, sweat beading despite the air-conditioned chill. Admiral Yamamoto's staff debated late into the night, voices rising in heated arguments. The paradox was clear. Japan needed air power to match America, but shipyards were strained, resources scarce. Battleships like the IZ sat idle, relics of a FAO era. The idea emerged. Convert them. Hybrid carriers, blending dreadnought guns with flight decks. A desperate gamble to flip the script in the Pacific. The plan called for 10 old battleships, but only 2 proceeded. Isa and her sister Hyuga. Hyuga's turret number 5 had exploded in a training mishap earlier that year, making her a prime candidate for refit. Work began in February 1943 at Kure Arsenal. 6 months of frantic labor. Yard workers, faces smeared with grease, torched away turrets number 5 and 6 aft, saving 2,500 tons of steel. In their place, a 70-meter flight deck, tapering from 29 meters wide forward to 18 aft. Below, a hangar for 22 to 24 aircraft, 12 HED, 4 Y dive bombers, 12 Yokosuka E-16 afloatplanes, 2 rotating catapults installed, steam-powered, but with a fatal bottleneck. 2 minutes per launch. No full landing strip. Planes had to ditch or hoist back aboard via crane. Anti-aircraft upgrades followed. 16 twin 5-inch 40 caliber guns, over 100 Type 96 25mm machine guns. But flaws crept in. The 25mm mounts vibrated under fire. Magazines too small for sustained bursts. Radar was Type 21 air search, Type 22 surface, but coverage gaps left 10-minute blind spots in bad weather. Pilot training lagged, only basic drills. By 1944, no combat launches. The chain of errors built. Japan prioritized speed and light armor, a thin-skinned hybrid that compromised both roles. Neither a true battleship nor a proper carrier. Compare to America. The Enterprise, with thick deck armor, launching over 100 planes a day, her air group turning tides at Guadalcanal. The Isa's refit wasted steel Japan couldn't spare. Canceled the full 10-ship plan due to shortages. A mystery unfolds. Why push this flawed compromise? Desperation blinded strategy. Before the hybrid madness, the Issei had proven her worth in earlier conflicts. The Sino-Japanese War erupted in 1937. She deployed to Shanghai in August, anchoring 3 nautical miles out. Turrets swung 45 degrees, unleashing 320 14-inch shells on ports and depots, confirming 12 targets destroyed, warehouses erupting in flames. The air grew hot with explosions, smoke choking the horizon, chaos on the shore as Chinese defenses crumbled. In May 1938 at Guangzhou, secondary guns fired 1,200 rounds, supporting infantry landings, blasting 5 ammo dumps sky-high. The blasts echoed across the bay, heat waves rippling the water, sailors wiping sweat from their eyes amid the roar. Captain's log noted no losses, but ammunition stocks dipped by 800 tons. These actions showcased her gunnery prowess, a dreadnought in her element. But the hybrid conversion changed everything. Completed in October 1943, the Izzy emerged. Transformed. Weight now 42,000 tons. Speed still 25 knots. Main guns reduced to 8 in 4 turrets forward. She conducted trials off the coast, catapults hissing steam, planes lifting off one by one. But the delays were evident. 2 minutes per aircraft meant slow deployment in battle. The hangar, cramped and vulnerable, held fuel and ordnance too close to the hull. Anti-aircraft drills revealed more issues. 25mm guns jammed after prolonged fire. Vibrations throwing off aim. Radar operators reported blind spots during storms, leaving the ship exposed for critical minutes. Pilot shortages compounded the problems. Japan's air arm decimated at Midway. Few experienced aviators left for hybrid ops. Training sessions in 1944 saw only simulated launches. No live combat drills. The mystery deepens. Born of desperation, be expected to counter America's carrier fleets? American designs like the Essex class emphasized robust armor and rapid air operations, with catapults cycling planes in seconds, hangars protected by layered decks. Japan's hybrid was a patchwork. Speed over durability, a thin compromise in a war of attrition. Fact is, the initial plan for 10 conversions evaporated. Steel shortages from Allied submarine campaigns, yard space tied up with repairs. Only Ise and Hyuga made the cut. A token effort in a losing game. This refit highlighted broader strategic flaws, clinging to battleship doctrine while carriers ruled the waves. The Ise, now a mongrel of the seas, sailed into 1944 ready for testing. But the real trial awaited at Leyte Gulf, where the hybrid's weaknesses would surface amid chaos. The trials began at Leyte Gulf, October 24 to 27, 1944. The largest naval battle in history, a desperate clash in the Philippines. The Imperial Japanese Navy threw everything in. Operation Shogo, a multi-pronged assault to halt the American invasion. The Eyes, now hybrid, joined Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force. Her role, bait. Draw Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet away from the beaches, exposing the landings to surface attacks. The air hung heavy with tension, salt spray mixing with the acrid smell of gun oil. Sailors on deck wiped sweat from their brows, eyes scanning the horizon under a relentless tropical sun. The cold vastness of the Philippine Sea contrasted with the building heat of impending combat. On October 25, off Cape Engano, the trap sprung. But for whom? Halsey's carriers launched 3 waves. Over 200 aircraft dove in. Alarms wailed across the ice. Crew rushed to stations, fingers gripping 25mm guns, hearts racing as shadows streaked the sky. The first wave hit hard. A 500-pound bomb glanced turret number 2 forward, exploding in a fireball that scorched the deck. Shrapnel tore through flesh. 5 men dead instantly. 71 wounded, their cries piercing the din. Blood slicked the plating, panic rippling through ranks as flames licked the hybrid flight deck. Officers shouted orders, fire teams sprayed hoses, but the heat intensified. Anti-aircraft batteries roared to life. 16 5-inch guns, over 125mm mounts barking. Tracers arced skyward, downing 5 American planes in fiery spirals. But the hybrid's flaws showed. Catapults, meant for quick launches, bogged down. 2 minutes per plane, an eternity in battle. Only 14 scout aircraft lifted off. No bombers, no fighters to counter the swarm. The hangar below, crammed with fuel and ordnance, became a liability, vulnerable to stray hits. The chain reaction threatened, but held off this time. Waves 2 and 3 pounded on. 34 bombs near missed, sending geysers sky high, rocking the ship like punches. Water cascaded over rails, soaking sailors already drenched in sweat. Amid the chaos, the eyes witnessed horror. Super battleship Musashi, her consort, took 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, sinking with over 1,000 souls. Debris floated past, survivors clinging to wreckage. The Isa's boats lowered, hauling 98 men from the carrier Zuiho, herself ablaze and listing. Cold sea water chilled the rescued, contrasting the inferno around. The hybrid survived, barely. Ammunition expended. 5,000 anti-aircraft rounds. Damage. Turret 2 jammed. Deck scorched, but afloat. Luck played its part, dodging direct hits that doomed others. Ozawa's force decoyed Halsey north, but the overall plan failed. Japanese losses: 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers. Leyte marked the Navy's death knell. A mystery here. Why did the Eyes endure Leyte's fury, only to perish swiftly at Kure? The hybrid's design offered clues. As decoy, she didn't need full carrier ops. Scouts sufficed, guns deterred, but flaws lingered. Catapults, Inefficient, no landing capability. Planes recovered elsewhere or lost. Compare to American Yorktown class. Integrated decks, rapid cycles, air wings dominating from afar. Japan's Frankenstein patch job. Guns aft removed for deck, balance off, stability reduced in rough seas. Post-Leyte, repairs at Cure. Catapults tweaked, one partially removed to improve amidships fire arcs. Gunnery enhanced, but desperation mounted. Fuel shortages grounded the fleet. By February 1945, Operation Kita, a supply run from Singapore to Japan. The Ise loaded petroleum and tin, escorting through enemy waters. 23 American submarines lurked, mines and reefs adding peril. Tension gripped the bridge, lookouts straining in dim light, sweat trickling as sonar pings echoed. No air launches. Hybrid idle again. Dodged torpedoes, arrived Kure intact. But stationary now, a floating battery, vulnerable to the skies. The chain led inexorably to Kure's end. Leyte exposed the hybrid's fragile survival. Panic amid waves, consequences of a desperate design. Japan clung to hope, but reality bit hard. The wreck of the Ise lies in Ondo Seto Channel, a silent grave in the depths of Kure Harbor. Cold seawater envelops the twisted steel. 50 meters down, where sunlight barely penetrates, sonar scans reveal the carnage. Turrets flipped upside down, the hybrid flight deck shattered into fragments, pagoda mast charred and crumpled. The hull, once proud, now a coral-encrusted tomb. Salvage crews in 1946 to 47 hauled up sections, scrapping the remains for post-war Japan. Turrets removed in 1948, melted down for industry. But the mystery lingers in those rusted bones. How did desperation forge this end? The final chain of events at Kure unfolded in March 1945. Fuel shortages crippled the fleet. Allied submarines choking supply lines, leaving the Ise stationary, a sitting duck as floating anti-aircraft battery. The first raid came March 19, 2 bombs striking amidships, damage repaired in hasty patches. Sweat-soaked welders worked round the clock, heat from torches mingling with the chill of impending doom. Then July, the hammer fell. Task Force 38 returned, waves of aircraft blanketing the sky. July 24, 5 direct hits. Captain killed on the bridge. 50 crew dead in the blast. Panic swept the decks. Men scrambling through smoke-filled corridors, cold fear gripping as fires spread. Survivors later recounted the heat. Flames licking bulkheads, air thick with acrid fumes. July 28 sealed it. 11 to 15 bombs struck, tearing through the hybrid additions. The hangar exploded, fuel igniting in a chain reaction. The ship listed sharply, cold water rushing in, drowning compartments in seconds. Abandoned ship orders rang out, but hundreds trapped below. 200 died on sister ship Hyuga that day. 600 wounded across the harbor. The Ise's end came swift, a culmination of flaws exposed. The mystery decodes here. Hybrid failure stemmed from compromise, not a dedicated battleship, nor a true carrier. A half measure in full war. Removing aft turrets for deck space unbalanced her, reduced firepower while adding vulnerability. Hangar too shallow, fuel too close to vitals. Anti-aircraft guns, numerous but ineffective. Vibrations and small magazines limited sustained fire. Radar gaps, 10 minutes blind in raids, proved fatal against massed American air attacks. Desperation drove it all. Japan wasted 2,500 tons steel on this, when new carriers could have been prioritized. Broader strategy crumbled, battleship cult persisting as carriers dominated. Comper legacies. America learned early. Air power rules. The Gerald R. Ford class today. 75 aircraft, electromagnetic catapults launching in seconds. Armored decks withstanding hits. China's Type 075 amphibious assault ships echo hybrid flaws. Mixed roles leading to compromises, questioned efficiency in modern conflicts. What if alternatives? Historians like David Hobbs speculate. Keep the eyes as pure battleship. Bolster anti-aircraft without deck. She might have fought at Guadalcanal's Solomons in 1942, matching the South Dakota, enduring 42 hits but surviving. Instead, hybrid path led to irrelevance. The eyes symbolizes an empire's fall, clinging to old ways amid innovation's tide. Ponder this. If Japan shifted to carriers sooner, could the Pacific War's outcome shift? The cold logic of history says no. American industrial might overwhelmed, yet the lessons endure. Air superiority decides battles. Hybrids often fail when pure designs excel. The East's wreck whispers warnings. Cold depths holding secrets of desperation's price.
Cheopyeong-ni, Korea, February 14th, 1951. Around 3 in the morning, a grenade lands in a machine gun position on the eastern perimeter. There are 6 men in that position. William Sitman looks at it. He has 1 second. 5 of those men lived. Their names are not in any history book. Neither is his. The Medal of Honor citation says he was fully aware of the odds against him. That phrase appears in hundreds of citations. It is the Army's way of saying he knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway. What the citation doesn't say, what no citation ever says, is why. This video is about the 36 hours before that moment. About 4,500 Americans and French soldiers surrounded by what U.S. estimates put at 25,000 Chinese troops, in a village nobody had heard of, in a war most Americans have already half forgotten, and what they did when everything said the math was already settled. About what happens inside a man between Tuesday morning and Wednesday night, and about why the soldiers who came home from that hill almost never talked about what happened there. If someone in your family served in Korea, or any war, this story is partly theirs. Hit the like button. It's the only way this channel can keep telling stories like this one. February 3rd, 1951. A crossroads village in the middle of the Korean peninsula. Colonel Paul Freeman spread the map on the table and looked at it for a long time. 1 railroad junction, 4 miles of perimeter, rice paddies on 3 sides, ridge lines on all of them. He had roughly 4,500 men, his own 23rd Infantry Regiment, a French battalion, artillery, engineers, a company of rangers. Intelligence reports put Chinese forces moving toward Cheopyeong-ni from the north, west, and south. Not a probe, not a patrol in force, an encirclement. Freeman sent a request up the chain to withdraw to better ground. It was denied. He called his officers together. No speeches, no flags. He put his hand on the map and said it plainly. An officer who was in that room wrote it down afterward in his diary. "We're surrounded. We'll stay here and fight it out." Then he told them what needed to be done by morning. The meeting was over. Freeman had 10 days to prepare before the Chinese came. He used all of them. Barbed wire unspooled across the full 4 miles of perimeter. Not a single gap left open. Machine gun positions were dug and sighted, so their fields of fire overlapped. If you came through one lane, you walked into another. Foxholes were cut into frozen ground that resisted the pickaxe like concrete. Artillery was registered on every approach. The gunners mapped out exactly where each round would land, before anyone fired a shot in anger. Every unit was given a sector. Every man knew the name of the unit on his left and his unit on his right. The order was simple and final. You do not leave your position to help the man beside you. Not without a direct order. That wasn't indifference. That was the one rule that kept a perimeter from collapsing from the inside. Lose one position, and the flank opens. Lose the flank, and the center goes. Lose the center, and everyone goes. Freeman had built the defense around one idea: every man holds, or nobody does. William Samuel Sitman was born on August 9, 1923. Bellwood, Pennsylvania. Blair County, a stretch of the Allegheny Mountains where the towns are small enough that the hardware store owner knows your father's name. His parents were Harry and Esther Sitman. He enlisted in February 1943, 20 years old. He was assigned to the 83rd Reconnaissance Battalion, 83rd Infantry Division. Shipped to England, landed in France in 1944, fought across Belgium into Germany. He received a Bronze Star somewhere in that campaign. The citation says gallantry. What that Bronze Star looked like on paper and what earning it actually cost are two different things. The 83rd Division fought through the Rhineland in the fall of 1944 and into the winter of 1945. That was not open country. It was hedgerow and village and bunker, house by house in some places, and the cold that settled into that part of Germany in December was the kind that got into the equipment the same way it got into the men. Reconnaissance work meant being forward of everyone else. It meant going out with a small group and coming back with information, or not coming back. Sitman was 20 years old when he landed in France, 21 when Germany surrendered. In those 14 months between Normandy and VE Day, he learned it the way everyone in France in 1944 learned it: that preparation was not something you did before the fight. It was something you did every morning, especially the mornings when nothing seemed to require it. He did not talk about any of this. There is no record that he ever did. But when Germany surrendered and the troop ships started loading for home, Sitman signed the papers to stay in. He was 21 years old. He re-enlisted. By the time Korea started, he had been in the Army 8 years. He was a sergeant first class, a machine gun section leader, Company M, 23rd Infantry Regiment. That was not a job you ended up in by accident. That was a job you built toward. One patrol, one range day, one piece of broken equipment fixed in the field at a time. He had a wife. He had a daughter. They were waiting in Bellwood. There is no record of what he wrote home from Korea, or whether he wrote at all. The Army kept his service record. The citation kept his name. The town kept his grave. That is all that made it back. Attached to Freeman's regiment was a battalion of French soldiers. Their commander went by the name Ralph Monclar. His real name was Raoul Charles Magrin-Verneret. He had been born in 1892, which made him nearly 60 years old when he stepped off a ship in Pusan in late 1950. He had been wounded 7 times in the First World War. The Army doctors had declared him 90% disabled when it was over. He went back to the Foreign Legion. He fought in Syria, Morocco, Indochina, Norway. In the Second World War, he had led the 13th Foreign Legion Demi-Brigade through the Free French campaigns. By 1950, he held the rank of Lieutenant General, 3 stars. When France decided to send a battalion to Korea, Monclar was told the problem: no general could command a unit that small. Regulations would not permit it. He asked for a demotion. Nobody had suggested it. Nobody had asked. He simply went to his superiors and told them he would accept the rank of lieutenant colonel if that was what it took to get on a ship. They said yes. He sailed for Korea. He was the ranking military officer in the French Army, choosing to serve as a battalion commander in a foreign war at age 59. He never explained why. He didn't seem to think it required explanation. By the morning of February 13th, 1951, Chipyong-ni had been a prepared defensive position for 10 days. The temperature was near 0 Fahrenheit. The ground was frozen solid. Sitman was up before first light. He checked his machine gun the way he checked it every morning. Not quickly, not by memory. He went through the weapon in the same order, touching every part: bolt assembly, feed cover, barrel. He worked the action by hand to feel the resistance. At these temperatures, metal contracted. Mechanisms that ran smooth in the fall could bind or hesitate, just enough to matter at the wrong moment. A machine gun that didn't fire when you needed it to was just weight. His assistant gunner sat nearby and watched. Sitman didn't narrate. He just did it. The younger man was learning the same way Sitman had learned, by watching someone who had done it long enough to do it right. That was how things passed from one man to the next out here. No classroom, no manual, just someone who knew, and someone who was watching. Mid-morning, the patrol reports came in. Confirmation of what Freeman had suspected for days. Chinese forces had completed the encirclement. There was no open route out of Chipyong-ni, not north, not west, not south. The hills surrounding the village were occupied. Freeman read the reports and made no changes to any plan. He had already prepared for this 10 days ago. The soldiers in their positions didn't receive a formal briefing on enemy strength. They didn't need one. They looked out past the wire in the afternoon light and saw movement on the ridgelines, smudges of shadow that resolved, if you watched long enough, into figures. They heard sounds from the hills that didn't belong to the wind. Nobody asked how many. That question had one answer, and the answer didn't change anything about what they had to do. In the afternoon, the perimeter went quiet, in the way a line goes quiet when both sides are preparing. The Chinese were up in those hills. Everyone knew it. You could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Not something you see, something in the air. Zitman walked the position once in the late afternoon, when the light was going flat and the shadows on the ridgelines to the east merged into one long gray shape. He checked the angles again. Knowing them and confirming them are different things. Confirmation mattered at a time like this. The wire ran at a slight angle to the northeast, a detail that changed the dead ground on the left side of the sector, created a lane about 12 feet wide, where anyone coming through wouldn't trip the first strand until they were already close. He'd flagged it to Freeman's people 3 days ago. They'd noted it. He checked it one more time. Still there. He walked back to the position. His assistant gunner was sitting with his back against the sandbags, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day. He looked up. Sitman didn't say anything. He sat down, took out a cloth, and started going over the machine gun again. They sat that way until the cooks brought the food up. Hot food. The cooks had managed it, somehow in a fortified village in the middle of a Korean winter, surrounded on all 4 sides. Hot food. The men ate. There was not much talking. A few of them wrote letters. Not farewell letters. Nobody used that language. Not openly. Just letters. A date. A location. A few sentences saying the weather had been cold and that things were all right. The kind of letter that says everything it doesn't say. None of them would go out that night. One soldier from D Company opened the unit diary, a plain notebook, the kind the Army issued for keeping records of the day's movements and casualties. He wrote the date at the top of the page. February 13th, 1951. He stopped. Nothing had happened yet. He closed the notebook and put it in his breast pocket, where it would stay until morning. Darkness came early in February. By 9 o'clock there was no light outside the perimeter wire. No moon, or not enough of one. The men in the foxholes could see the tips of the stakes holding the barbed wire if they looked hard enough. Beyond that, nothing. Then, close to 10 o'clock, the sound started. It came from the north first, horns, not a few, many, and from the west, then the south, all at once, high and clear in the frozen air. Many of the men in those foxholes had heard that sound before. 3 months earlier, in late November 1950, when 300,000 Chinese soldiers had come out of the hills at night and hit the advancing American lines before anyone could count what was coming. Units had broken. Men had run. Not everyone. Some had held. But enough had run that the army had retreated 275 miles in 6 weeks, the longest retreat in American military history. The men listening to those horns in the dark at Chipyong-ni had been part of some version of that November. Some of them had run. None of them ran tonight. Route 24 ran straight into the north end of Chipyong-ni. It was the main road into the village, the only paved surface for miles in any direction. Whoever held Route 24 controlled the one route a relief column could use to get in. The Chinese understood that. They hit it first. Company C was dug in along the northern perimeter. By 11 o'clock, the first assault had pushed them back from a forward position, a section of trench, 20 yards of wire, a firing lane they'd spent 3 days zeroing in. They took it back. The Chinese came again. They pushed back again. A third time. The same ground, the same wire, the same freezing dark. They took it back a third time. Nobody left the road. There was no order keeping them there. Every man on that line understood the same arithmetic. Lose Route 24, and the door closes from the outside. No relief column. No resupply by ground. Whatever was going to happen in Chipyong-ni was going to happen inside this perimeter, with what was already here. They held the road. On the western side of the perimeter, around 2 in the morning, a Chinese platoon moved down from the hills toward the French sector. They came with horns. The Chinese used horns to signal the attack. Everyone in that theater knew the sound. It had been one of the things men talked about afterward, in the field hospitals and the letters home. The way the horns came from the dark before you could see anything. The way the sound moved. Monclar was standing at the edge of the French position, in the dark, with his coat pulled tight. 59 years old. 7 old wounds that the army had documented, and 4 more that hadn't made it into any official file. A man who had been walking into situations like this one for 40 years, since he was a junior officer on the Western Front in 1914, since the mud and wire of the Somme, since the sand and heat of the Foreign Legion's campaigns in the years between the wars. He had heard battle signals his whole life. He knew exactly what those horns meant. He also knew something else. Sound in the dark is its own kind of weapon. The horns worked for the Chinese because they created confusion, because soldiers who heard them couldn't immediately locate the source, couldn't tell direction from echo, because the sound preceded the assault and gave the defenders no time to think before the first men were already close. He made his decision in roughly the time it takes to form a thought. He didn't order his men to fire. He ordered them to answer. The French had hand-crank air raid sirens, the kind that could be turned by hand in the dark. No electricity needed. Monclar ordered them started. The sound that came back from the French line was close enough to a Chinese battle signal to stop the advance cold. 30 yards out. 50 yards. The Chinese platoon hesitated. In the dark, with their own signals being reflected back at them from an unexpected direction, they couldn't read what they were walking into. Monclar gave the next order. Fix bayonets. The French came out of their positions. They didn't make the kind of noise you see in the films. They ran toward where the sound had been, into the dark, and they used the bayonets. The Chinese platoon broke. When it was over, the French had 15 prisoners and their position intact. A radio report went to Freeman's command post. He read it, didn't say anything, wrote it in the log, kept moving down the line. By 4 in the morning, Company C still held Route 24. The ground they'd given up and taken back had changed hands 3 times in the night. It was still theirs. Sitman's position was on the eastern perimeter. Sometime in the night, a Chinese grenade found the heavy machine gun his section had been running. Not a direct hit on the man, on the weapon. The gun seized. The mechanism that had to work for the gun to function bent out of alignment in a way that couldn't be fixed in the dark with cold hands. The gun was done. A squad from Company I came forward with a light machine gun and started setting it up in the same position. They were replacing the weapon, not the crew. Different men, different gun, same stretch of wire. Sitman's formal responsibility had ended when his gun went down. He stayed. The Company I men were new to this corner of the line. They hadn't spent 3 days learning the dead ground to the east, hadn't watched the approach angles in daylight, didn't know where the wire sagged and where it held firm. They were putting a gun into position they'd never seen before, in the dark, with people trying to kill them. Sitman knew that ground, so he stayed. The Chinese came again. A second grenade came into the position. 6 men. It landed between them. Sitman looked at it. 1 second. He threw himself on it. 5 men kept firing. The citation says he was fully aware of the odds against him. That phrase has always seemed to me like the Army's way of saying something it doesn't have a form for. February 14th, 1951. Valentine's Day. Sometime in the early morning hours, a mortar round landed near Colonel Freeman. A fragment caught him in the left calf. He didn't go to the aid station. He kept moving along the perimeter, checking positions, talking to men. His leg was bandaged at some point. The accounts don't specify when or by whom, and he kept going. By morning, word of the wound had reached Lieutenant General Edward Almond, the ex-corps commander. Almond dispatched a helicopter. With it came his own chief of staff, there to assume command of the regiment and see Freeman out. The helicopter landed. Freeman was not at the landing site. Accounts suggest he made himself difficult to locate until the situation resolved itself to his satisfaction. What is recorded is what happened when he finally did encounter the man who had come to replace him. He told him, "Stay out of my way. There's a battle going on." A compromise was reached eventually. Freeman would leave, but at a time of his choosing, after the battle was finished. He went back to the line. That afternoon, a helicopter came in from a different direction. It landed inside the perimeter. Matthew Ridgway stepped out. He had flown into a village surrounded on all sides because he wanted to see it himself. He walked the positions, talked to men where they stood, looked at the wire and the fields of fire and the faces. He found Freeman. "Can you hold one more night?" Freeman said yes. Ridgway nodded. He got back in the helicopter and flew out. The soldier from D Company took the notebook out of his breast pocket. He wrote 4 words, "One more night." He put the notebook back. The firing died down before full light, not all at once. Position by position, the exchanges thinned out, the intervals between shots grew longer, and then there was silence. Not the silence before an attack, but the silence of something having spent itself. By the time it was fully light, the Chinese assault had pulled back into the hills. It would come back. Everyone on the line knew it would come back. But for now, for a few hours, it was quiet. The first thing Freeman did at dawn was walk the perimeter, not in a jeep, on foot. His left calf was wrapped tight enough that he could bear weight on it if he kept the leg straight. He moved slowly along the line, stopping at each position, looking at the wire, looking at the men. He didn't give speeches. He asked questions. "How many rounds do you have left? Who's your best gunner? Where's the weak point in your sector?" The men answered. He listened. He moved to the next position. By the time he'd walked the full 4 miles, the sun was up and the cold had settled into the kind of flat, dry clarity that sometimes comes after a night of hard fighting. Everything very sharp and very still. the ridgelines hard-edged against the sky. The wounded were collected. The dead were moved back from the forward positions. Not far. There was nowhere far to take them, but away from the wire, so the men holding those positions didn't have to look at them. There were more than 100 casualties from the night. The men who could still fight accounted for themselves and went back to their positions. The men who couldn't were moved to the aid station in the center of the perimeter, where the doctors and the medics had been working without stopping since 10 o'clock the previous night. Nobody counted the hours. There wasn't time to count hours. The resupply came from the air. 24 separate passes over the perimeter through the course of the day. Aircraft dropping bundles of ammunition, food, medical supplies. They came in low, inside the ring of hills, while Chinese anti-aircraft fire reached up from the ridgelines. Some bundles missed. They landed outside the wire, in the open ground between the perimeter and the hills, where no one could get to them. The men watched those bundles from their positions and left them there. The ones that landed inside were broken open and distributed. For the first time since the night before, the men had full ammunition loads. Around midday, a soldier from one of the northern companies found an unbroken box of sea rations in the supply area and sat down against a wall to eat. Just a wall. A brick wall from a building that had been half destroyed weeks before, leaving a section of foundation still standing, tall enough to block the wind. He ate slowly. He'd been awake for more than 30 hours. After a while, he leaned his head back against the brick and closed his eyes. He wasn't asleep. He would have said he wasn't asleep, but when someone touched his shoulder an hour later, he came up with a start, hand already on the rifle. He was still in Chipyong-ni. He checked the rifle, ate the last of the ration, got up and went back. That was the afternoon of Valentine's Day, 1951. None of them knew, sitting in those holes in the frozen ground, that military historians would eventually call this battle the Gettysburg of the Korean War. They knew one thing: the second night was coming. The Chinese came again after dark on February 14th. The same positions, the same wire, the same approaches that had been contested the night before. The second night was different from the first. The ammunition was fuller. The line was intact. But none of that was the reason. The men in those positions had made it through one night already. That sounds small. It isn't. There is a specific kind of knowledge that comes from holding a position through the worst of it and finding yourself still there at dawn. It doesn't make you unafraid. It doesn't make the next attack smaller or slower or less dangerous. It just means you know something you didn't know before. You know you can do it. That knowledge was in every foxhole on the second night at Chipyong-ni. The Chinese had brought the same force they'd brought the first night. The same tactics. The darkness and cold were identical. They were not fighting the same men. They held the second night. February 15th, 1951. Before dawn. A sound from the south. Not the Chinese horns. Not artillery. Lower, mechanical, getting louder. Tanks. The 1st Cavalry Division had broken through. Armor came up the road from the south, the same Route 24 that Company C had held through 2 nights of fighting, and rolled into Chipyong-ni. The Chinese pulled back, not in pieces, in an organized withdrawal by unit. Captured documents recovered in the days following the battle showed why. Chinese commanders had gone into the attack estimating roughly 1,000 UN troops inside the Chipyong-ni perimeter. The actual number was more than 4 times that. What they encountered: a fully prepared defense, adequate ammunition after the airdrops, and men who held positions under sustained assault for 2 consecutive nights, was not what their intelligence had told them to expect. They withdrew to recalculate. They never attacked in those numbers again. U.S. Army records, drawing on captured documents, put Chinese casualties at over 5,000 around the perimeter. more than 50 Americans were killed. More than 250 were wounded. Colonel Freeman was evacuated on February 15th after the tanks arrived. He did not return to command the 23rd Infantry Regiment. He recovered, returned to duty, and eventually retired as a 4-star general in 1966. Lieutenant Colonel Monclar led the French battalion through the rest of the 1951 campaign. He went home to France when it was over and had his 3 stars restored. He died in 1964 at 72. They named a bicycle path after him in Yangpyeong County in 2023. His wife received a telegram from the Army before the letter came. That was how it worked. The telegram arrived first. A brief official statement of the facts, name and unit and date, killed in action. The letter came after, with more words that said the same thing. She was in Bellwood when the telegram arrived. Their daughter was not yet 2 years old. There is no record of what she said when she read it. There is no account of that morning in any archive. The Army kept records of the action. The town kept the grave. What happened inside that house on the day the telegram came stayed inside that house. A year later, she stood at the Pentagon and received the Medal of Honor on behalf of her husband. Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett placed it in her hands. The citation was read aloud. Fully aware of the odds against him, selflessly threw himself on it, absorbing the full force of the explosion with his body. She took the medal home to Bellwood. William Sitman is buried at Logan Valley Cemetery, on the east side of town, not far from the road his parents would have known. He was 27 years old. On Main Street in Bellwood, there is a small stone marker. The American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars put it up. It says he gave his life that others might live. Most people drive past it without stopping. Chipyeong-nai is called Jipyeong-ri now. It's a farming village in Yangpyeong County, about 40 miles east of Seoul. There's a brewery there, rice wine locally made, the kind of place people go to on weekends. The hills around the village look the way hills look when nothing has happened in them for a long time. Every February, a small group of American and Korean veterans meets in the village to mark the anniversary. The group gets smaller every year. If your father served in Korea, or your grandfather, your uncle, anyone who came home from that peninsula and didn't say much about it, there's a good chance he was in a hole like this one, at least once. Korea was called the Forgotten War, before it was even over. The men who were there knew it while they were still fighting. But maybe there was one night at the dinner table. One story he told once and never repeated. One thing he said that you never forgot. Even if he seemed to forget, he said it. Leave it in the comments, his name, his unit. That one thing. Those stories don't belong in the silence. They belong here.